Hey there, friends. Welcome into another episode of the Winsome Creationist. In this one, we're going to go through part 2 of my conversation with Mark on the top 10 objections from the Bible to Young Age Creationism. So I hope you enjoyed last week's episode, and I think you're going to enjoy this week's episode as well. Enjoy it, take care, and we'll see you next time.
Okay, well, let's get on to the next one.
Number 4, Genesis 1:14-19. The most popular objection used against Young Earth Creationism is the fact that nights and days exist before the sun, which is created on day 4. Days and nights cannot exist without the earth rotating and moving around the sun. Young Earth believers often reply by suggesting maybe there was another light source, or they will argue that God made the light on day 1 and then gathered it together into the sun on day 4. But this seems unlikely, since Genesis 1 talks about the sun and the moon being created together as lights, and the composition of the moon is not the same as the sun. You cannot gather light together to make the moon. It only reflects light from the sun. Also, you just cannot separate the sun into pieces and have the same resulting chemistry necessary to provide sunlight for plants, supposedly created on day 3. This whole response from Young Earth Creationists is simply contrived and ad hoc. A more likely explanation is the sun and moon are just elected to serve as signs for seasons and for days and years, instead of being materially created. And this is what Genesis 1 is actually saying.
Okay, so how on earth do we get this whole thing with light before there being the source of the light? Let me just out of the gate, I don't know, maybe I'll start a fight. Maybe this can get interesting. I'm not a concordist, so I don't care.
Can you define that for the audience?
So concordism is basically the view that what you read in Scripture as it's describing has to have it matching with the world, have a scientific explanation, that it's showing something specific, like, so where it's saying, God said, let there be light over here, he's creating light, but then over here, he's making the sun and moon, and hey, that's, the sun is the literal source of the light. And so I'm an accommodationist. I think that God, whenever he was talking, he was using the language and the descriptors of the times that the people would understand the point he was trying to get across. The example I always use is the Isaiah, oh goodness, it's either 22:44 or 44:22, where God sits above the circle of the earth, and I've heard people say, oh, well, that circle, see right there, it's saying that the earth is round. And I'm like, no, or I've either heard people say that word for circle actually means like a ball, so it's like a sphere, it's like a globe, and I've heard people say, oh, well, it's a circle like a disc, so Isaiah believed the earth was flat. I'm like, I don't think it's either one. I think Isaiah was just saying that God is sovereign over the earth.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm good with that. I don't need to have a specific explanation of the word circle describing the literal shape of the earth. I'm good with whatever. Maybe Isaiah believed that the earth was a flat disc. I don't care what Isaiah believed, because the point he's making is not about the shape of the earth. It's about God being sovereign over it. So that's, and so, so in Genesis 1, if you're going to nitpick about, the scientific issues, which is really funny that he's bringing up, the science. Well, this can't be because the science, it's like, well, wait a minute. You don't even believe that Genesis is teaching scientific stuff. So why is he bringing that up? Except he thinks that we do. So,
yes. Yeah.
I'll let you approach it, because I'm not sure where you land on that. So
it depends on what day of the week it is and whether or not I've had my coffee yet. Honestly, I do. I go back and forth almost on some of these issues, especially concordism versus non-concordism, and where, I mean, I don't think. I think I'm comfortable going on record to say that I am a non-concordist, because I think concordism almost has to assume that you have people that the whole scientific foreknowledge thing that was common in the creationist movement of decades gone by, I think you almost have to assume some of that, and I'm not comfortable, given what I have learned about the Bible, affirming that. In fact, let me go a little bit further. I almost think that the natural outworking of a concordist interpretation of Scripture is the Old Earth view. I might want to qualify that a little bit if I was in a more deep discussion with people, but when I hear Hugh Ross talk about his concordism, I'm like, he's right. I can, if you're a concordist, I kind of can see how you get that view from it. And I'm like, I don't think that's the correct view. So we want to make sure that we're not confusing science and Scripture, and that we are letting them inform each other, but we have to be clear about which one wins when there is a conflict. So in general, that is where I stand on that. Now, with respect to the text that he brought up, yeah, Tyler and I have gone back and forth on this one as well. I still don't see how it affects. I mean, I know Young Earth Creationist, Old Earth Creationist, and Don't Care Creationists who all affirm some version of the light being created, of even the sun having been created on day one, or at the beginning, absolute beginning of creation. So I don't even necessarily think that there's a hard contradiction in the Young Earth view. If you take that approach, I do take the approach that the sun was created on day 4. I think that those who want to make the point about the Bible teaching a polemic point, on that, and that the sun is not named and that it is created, after the creation of some of the other elements and by God, I think that it makes more sense from a polemic view. And polemic just basically means that it takes shots at the gods of other nations and the worldview beliefs of other nations. I actually believe that point is made stronger if the sun was literally not created until day 4. There's a book by a Hebrew scholar, a well-respected Hebrew scholar, David M. Fouts. And I mean, again, this guy is friends with, you pick your favorite Hebrew scholar, he's friends with him, I promise. And he wrote a book in 2007, I think, called Right from the Start. And it's calling evangelical leaders back to the truth of God's word in Genesis 1 and 2, I think is something like that. And he gives a scholarly approach in the popular, it's a popular format, but he delves deep into the Hebrew language, and actually deals with these texts and exegetes them, and argues for their being, a literal account of creation. And this is a guy who's well up on ancient Near Eastern studies, Semitic studies. I mean, he knows all of this stuff, and yet he still comes down on this view. And there's a passage here, I've got the book pulled up, where he argues, and I'm kind of going back and forth on whether or not I should actually read this little excerpt or not. I think I'm going to not read it, but I will tell you the book is worth picking up. Again, it's Right from the Start by David M. Fouts, and you can get it. I've got it in Logos and on Kindle, I believe. So you can definitely get it in both places. And he goes into great detail. In detail, as much detail as you can in a paragraph or two, about how that the Hebrew verbiage, the actual way the text is structured, very strongly argues that the point of that the text is making is that the sun and the moon were created as a direct response to the command that God was making. It's not as though they were just made to appear or something like that. There's other language that could have been used if that was the intent. The idea is that each of these This is a direct quote. Each of these, so the two great lights, the greater light, the lesser light, and the stars, each of these direct objects has its own separate direct object marker, et. It's in the Hebrew language, et. This indicates that they were all created in response to God's command, and most likely at the same time, as they are followed in verse 19 with the temporal summary. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. End quote. So anyway, point there is that there are Hebrew scholars who think that the point that Michael is making is not right, and they'll argue this based on the Hebrew language. So again, whether or not it's a material account of creation really isn't even pertinent to the issue of whether age is in view. But even if you think it is for some reason, there is evidence in the text itself to suggest that very strongly, actually, that material creation of these things was in view, and it was their direct, a direct response to God's command.
So just to kind of think about our options, and that was really good. I like that. Just think about our options. Okay, so it's literally that on that day, those verses are literally meaning that the sun and the moon were created. Mm-hmm. And people say, well, what was the light he created before? I'm perfectly comfortable with, I don't know.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm fine with that answer. It's one of those things where it's like, I have no idea. And I don't need to, I don't need to actually have the scientific explanation of, he, in the video, he goes into about, the this and that. It's like, I don't need all that. I don't know what it was. God knows what it was.
Try it.
But okay, so on that view, okay, Young Earth Creation, viable option. You got what Jones presented about, light was created before, and then verse 14 is functionality. Okay. Cool. How does that do anything at all to undermine the age question?
Mazel tov, man. Cool.
It doesn't affect whatsoever. Or you can go to where I've heard people argue that this contradiction, this kind of thing, it's talking all figurative, just shows that Genesis 1 isn't to be taken literal, which, okay, now we're back to Genesis 2 being the beginning of the timeline. Young Earth Creation still on the table. We've done nothing to undermine it or disprove the Bible teaching it. Okay.
Mic drop.
Next.
Number 3, Genesis 1:28. As noted before, Young Earth believers say before the fall, the earth was blissful and perfect, with no death or suffering. But Genesis 1:28 suggests the opposite was true. Humanity is told to subdue the earth and have dominion over all animals. In Hebrew, these words are extremely harsh. The first word is used of war conquest and enslavement. The second word refers to ruling harshly over someone, or oppression. So God is telling humans to make a warlike conquest on the earth because it needs subdued, implying the earth wasn't perfect, and humanity was elected to transform the earth into a better place. But to do that meant tackling the harsh environments forcefully. The scholar Joshua John Van E notes the use of the second word for ruling over the animals seems to suggest humans had the right to use animals for any purpose, like food and clothing, implying they already had the right to kill and eat animals. But this means the command from God implies the earth was not a perfect, blissful creation. Instead, this verse implies the earth was chaotic and needed order brought to it. Also, humans seem to be given the right to kill animals, implying death was already in existence.
Okay, so apparently the earth wasn't all paradise. Eden was all cool and stuff, but outside of Eden was all wilderness and chaos.
I mean,
so therefore, Young Earth Creation is done.
I mean, that little verse right there, if you caught Michael's drift, implied an awful lot of things. I mean, I almost don't know where to start. Okay. So to your first point there, I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to do with guys like Heiser who say, it could be that the entire earth was in Eden. Okay. So let's say I grant that point. It doesn't necessarily mean that the entire earth was full of evolutionarily evolving humans either. Okay. I think I would be willing to grant that the entire earth could have been filled and probably was filled. Yeah, probably was filled during creation with certainly animals. But I don't think we can say, especially from the text, that they were harsh or that they were, that they were playing by different rules. This is where, again, we're getting into the weeds a little bit here, but, this is where I'm a little undecided on the animal death thing. Now, if someone were to press me, I would say that I hold the view that there was no animal death before the fall either. But I'm comfortable admitting that there's a little bit of argument from silence going on there on my part from Genesis. I mean, Genesis 1:28 seems to suggest that the animals that were created were vegetarians. So I think, that probably lends itself to the view that there was no animal death before the fall. But there are good Young Earth Creationist brothers that I have who do affirm animal death before the fall, just not human death. So I don't have all of that worked out in my mind. Are you? Yeah. Would you be one of those? Yeah.
I definitely lean that way. I mean, I'm
Sure.
definitely, it's the arguments that there were no animal death just seem weak to me. I'm unconvinced.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's not like I don't think it impugns God's character at all that animals would die, because I'm sorry, they're animals. Human death I could see could impugn his character, but not the animal death. And so I'm okay. I actually I agree with everything. I agree with what he said. That I kind of view it like not that the earth was just some, just massive, chaotic, crazy. It was untamed wilderness. It was uncultivated, untamed wilderness.
Sure.
In Eden, you had the garden where everything was in perfect order,
the abode of God,
paradise, and then God said, "Hey, go make the rest of the world look like this. Go cultivate it. Go tame that wilderness."
Sure.
And I believe that's the view I hold.
No,
and it doesn't do anything to change the age of the earth.
No, that's true. Now, I obviously I think at this point it almost has to be a given that with respect to the point of the video that somehow this has something to do with the age of the earth. I think we left that a long time ago. It just we're almost beyond that now. We're talking about something different at this point, because it obviously doesn't prove anything about the age for the earth. I do think I'm troubled in my mind by things like, well, what do you do with the fossil record? What do you do with thorns and thistles? What do you do with the introduction of cancer and harmful diseases and things like that? These are things that seem to it seems to suggest, the Bible seems to suggest that these things resulted from the curse on the ground. It doesn't seem to me that the ground was only cursed in Eden, because Adam had to toil and do the hard work outside of Eden. So obviously it was the ground outside of Eden that was cursed.
Well, and it was in Eden, like, if Eden was home base, food was plentiful. He wasn't going to have to toil to survive.
Right.
The work and the toil would be taming the wilderness.
Yeah.
Which, would have been a fun, and I don't think that, like, whenever I say, outside of Eden, it was, untamed wilderness, maybe there weren't thorns and thistles.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And that came later. Maybe,
sure. Maybe it's not A or C. Maybe it's B, right? Maybe it's it could, right? And that's more so just speculation.
I absolutely do believe that there were very real physical effects of the fall, with like diseases and cancer, and there were real things that happened with to the earth and the functionality of the earth, the curse upon it, and then of course a global flood then completely just messes up everything. If that really
and of course, so much of that is actually dependent upon the curse itself. yeah, the ground was cursed and things like that. But with cancer and different things like that coming into the picture, you can really only have that stuff if you get degradation genetically. Now we're getting into science, but if you get genetic degradation, and that stuff is going to happen almost naturally as a result of the immortality of the source of life being cut off, the tree of life.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a, part of the curse is leaving Eden, but I think the actual ground was probably cursed too. If you think at the, well, I mean, that's just what the text says. So
Well,
I would think that.
And one of the things in these kind of, I find that a lot of times, and I'm just as guilty as anyone, that there's all kinds of extra things that we add into being implied that the text doesn't actually say.
Yeah.
So
you're right.
So like about the thorns and thistles. Oh, so it was wild outside Eden, so there were thorns and thistles. I don't know. Maybe there were, maybe there weren't. It doesn't actually tell us. It just says that now, as he tries to produce food, he's going to have to contend with thorns and thistles. Whereas in Eden, he wouldn't have to. So,
good point.
But again, you come around, top 10 ways the Bible doesn't teach young earth.
How? Yeah.
How? What is this? This doesn't have anything to do with the dating.
Well, and I'll make a more direct point here. So he's pointing out two Hebrew words that he says specifically, they both had to do with essentially a harsh, sort of subduing a it's like a forceful type thing. He actually says that what God's doing is telling humans to mount, I wrote this down, to mount a warlike conquest on the earth. To me, go ahead.
I was going to say, have you read any historical accounts of the settlers in North America? Carving out civilization in the colonies? That was waging a war on the the wilderness environment in order to carve out a place for civilization.
Yeah.
So that language doesn't. Yeah. Okay. Small church. A little country preacher here. You got to wage war on the land.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want uncultivated land to grow something, hey, waging war is a very good descriptor of what you're having to do to it.
Sure. I think that's fair. But I don't think it implies that means that like I'm not sure entirely. Well, I think I know what his point is. I mean, I think his point is that animals and other and other humans that were not, Adam and Eve, essentially, were going to have to be, brought under subjection. And I mean, the point is this, like, these context determines meaning of a word. That's just how it works. Context determines meaning. Both of these words are used in contexts in the Bible where they do not imply a sort of harsh rule. As a matter of fact, in 1 Kings 4, 24 and 25, it specifically points to Solomon's rule, his radah, as being a peaceful rule. So it doesn't necessarily imply that. And again, David Fouts made the point in his book that actually what you see, especially if you take it, with the language of Adam and Eve being made in the image of God and as God's essentially vice regents, to rule as God's image on the earth, that really what you see here is it suggests that Adam and Eve had the kind of rulership that kings had. And kings, sure, at times ruled with force, but they could also rule peacefully. The point is that they brought the land into subjection, that they that they began to care for the land, that they began to take responsibility for the land, to make it, to demand that these words teach that they were going to have to fight predatory animals before the fall, I think is too much of a stretch. I think it could mean that, but it certainly doesn't necessarily mean that. These words could be very comfortably used in a more peaceful context. You know, I mean, did the author? I'm more likely to think. I mean, good heavens! I mean, it talks about, you know, having this kind of rule over the fish of the sea or whatever. I mean, you know, I don't think what we're talking about is like getting in these wrestling matches with bears and whales. That's almost what I see in my mind when I see this point being made. I think what you're saying is a lot more like I'm happy with the warlike language if what's being implied here is something like, you know, like actually having to war with the land to take the land into subjection and to subdue it. But think about it, like, is that really all it means? Like so I one of my favorite books is Faith, Form, and Time by Dr. Kurt Wise. It's an old book, but it's still very pertinent today. It was written in 2001. And Dr. Wise is a scientist, a creationist. And
did you just refer to a book written in 2001 as old?
Well, in scientific terms, yes. Yeah, I see your point, but in scientific terms, 2001 is basically ancient. So yeah, that's why I did that. But yes. Yeah, so the point is, though, like, he uses this passage as a justification for doing science, for caring for the land, for learning more about the land, for studying about the land. And I see no reason to think that that's not implied just as much as anything else. You know, I mean, the only consistent environmentalism is Christian environmentalism. And where do we get that from but something like the Dominion Mandate? So I mean, I guess if you want to use that warlike language, fine, but let's define what we mean by that. And before we move on, even if it does mean that he had to fight predatory bears, even if it does mean that lions and tigers and bears and cheetahs, oh my, were out to get him, I still have no idea why that had to happen if he's right over millions of years rather than you know, just thousands of years ago.
Yeah, there's nothing there that would necessarily imply old age. It just means that was their job, a different understanding of what they were called to than some people hold.
Yeah,
Okay.
and actually, let me say that this, because now I'm remembering what the point that I was trying to make way back at Jeremiah 4, and that is the best case scenario is that this sort of interpretation would be consistent with an old age. That's the best case scenario, but it certainly doesn't argue for an old age. If anything, it argues for a young age. At best, it's consistent with an old age.
Yeah. Okay, next.
Number 2, bara. Number 2 is not so much a passage, but the use of a Hebrew word. Many young earth creationists believe this word refers to God creating out of nothing, and it is used frequently throughout Genesis 1. But looking at how the word is used outside of Genesis 1 implies bara doesn't necessarily mean creation out of nothing, and might not even refer to material creation at all. John Walton has done a full semantic analysis on the word, and he points out the word never necessarily means creation out of nothing, and there are several times it cannot mean that. In Psalm 51, the author uses bara to ask God to make a new clean heart within him. This obviously doesn't refer to the creation of a new material heart out of nothing. In Isaiah 65, it refers to electing Jerusalem to be a place of joy. In Isaiah 43, it refers to creating the nation of Israel, which came about over time and through natural processes. In Ezekiel 21, it refers to making a sign. It is even used to refer to David not eating food. There are times it could refer to material creation out of nothing, but it never necessarily does, and there are clear examples where bara cannot refer to material creation. So there is no reason to assume that that is the meaning in Genesis 1, especially given the previous problems that we have gone over. Kenneth Matthews notes bara more likely refers to bringing about activity rather than material manufacturing, implying Genesis 1 is not about material creation.
You know, I think this is another one of those where you could basically just land yourself in a match of scholar quotation ping pong.
Yes.
You know, because notice he said it doesn't necessarily mean creation from nothing. Well, yeah, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not saying creation from nothing.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep. You're exactly right. And with respect to this particular point, yeah, you're right. You could just go back and forth. I mean, Paul Copan and William Lane Craig have an entire book about this called "Creation Ex Nihilo," where they examine the evidence for creation ex nihilo, be it in the Bible and in Genesis 1. Might be a good resource to look at as well. And I know different Hebrew scholars that are divided on this. That they really are. But the point of the word bara, though, is I think that I originally wrote down when I was taking notes on this that this was a straw man of the Young Earth Creationist view. And while in some respects that may be true, I also think that a lot of Young Earth Creationists just get this wrong. There is a significance to the word bara, but it's not in that it only necessarily means material creation. In fact, I think I should say at least many Young Earth Creationists, especially, educated ones who write books and are, public about this stuff, I don't think any of them would argue that bara is used exclusively of material creation. What we do argue, truthfully, is that in the Bible, the word bara is only ever the subject of the word bara is always Yahweh. It's always God. It's the God of the Bible. That's the real significance behind it. So I guess I don't know if I should amen Michael here. Probably, I don't know, because I agree it is used in material and non-material creation. At least it appears to be. But the point is that it's only ever used of God. It's only ever used of Yahweh. Yahweh is the only one who can bara. Others can asa or yatsar. These are all synonymous words, Hebrew words, but only God can bara.
Okay. And just another thing that I think it would, you know what, this kind of actually leads into the next one, so I'll save that comment for there. This is one of those things where it's like, okay,
Cool.
you didn't actually, again, good job. I don't know what this has to do with the actual age, because the age, and I'll stress this a little more in the closing, age has to do with the timeline.
Right.
It actually has to do with what events happened and when. Okay, so bara, creation from nothing, not creation. Okay. Next.
Yep. Next.
And now finally, number 1, Genesis 1, verse 1. This may come as a shock to you, but the very first verse of the Bible can create difficulties for young Earth models. The reason is, over the past few decades, scholars have noted the first verse lacks a definite article in Hebrew, so the way we translate it may not be accurate. Instead, scholars like John Salhammer and Robert Homestead have argued it would make more sense to translate it as when God began to create the heavens and the earth. What this would mean is verse 1 is no longer a complete sentence, but what we would call a dependent clause in an incomplete sentence. So this would mean verse 1 is dependent on the following clause, which is in verse 2. So Genesis is really saying, when God began to bara the heavens and the earth was formless and void. In other words, when God started baraing the heavens and the earth, it was already there as formless and void. So many scholars note this implies Genesis 1 is not about bringing the universe and the earth into existence for the first time, but is about God transforming the earth from a chaotic state into an ordered state. If the Hebraic form of verse 1 and 2 implies the earth was already there existing before the creation week, then the text supports an extended period of time prior to this and is not actually stating the absolute beginning point of our universe.
Okay, we got Genesis 1:1 all completely wrong. We're toast. You know what's interesting, and I had a few points that I'd written down, but one thing that had just occurred to me as I was listening to that this time, if God Well, if it Genesis 1:1 is where God, reordered, and planet had existed for a long time before that. Science doesn't work. It doesn't matter what the actual age that the universe and Earth had been around, because everything would date back to Genesis 1:1, because that's where God started shaping. So you would not have any scientifically testable and observable or anything kind of processes going before that, because at Genesis 1:1, it all changed.
Right.
So right there, all of the old Earth science models, just threw them in the trash.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. And this is another one that kind of has to do with that, scholar this and scholar that says one thing and says the other. Again, I'll point you to David Fouts' book. He just grammatically he goes through this objection, and just shows why it would be arbitrary and quite spurious, actually, to say that this that we should interpret this verse without the definite article. In other words, it would make much more sense grammatically to include the definite article. You have other cases in the Bible that you can point to where if you were to exclude the definite article with the grammatical structure being exactly the same, then it would be absurd. So, there's technical reasons that go beyond my, time to explain them to you right now, and even some of my own personal understanding, but I can read and comprehend what he says, and I think the argument goes through. So again, this is one of those things where, okay, well, he may be true, he may be right about that. I actually know young earth creationists who take varying positions on this, and they're all young earth creationists, and the reason is because this verse does not affect the age of creation, the date of creation, and the age of the earth thereafter. So I know scholars who will take Hebrew scholars and also scientists and others who will take verse 1, Genesis 1:1, as a summary statement, what they call an introductory encapsulation, such that it is not a statement of material creation, but yet a summary statement. It is, of course, a merism, because there's no word for universe in Hebrew. So a merism takes kind of the two extremes of a whole, the heavens and the earth, in order to takes the two ends of the extremes, the two parts, to explain the whole. So and you can still hold that it's a merism, and at the same time hold that it's a literal statement of creation, or you can hold that it's not a literal statement of creation, at which point the literal state of creation begins with verse 2, with it explaining how the actual state of the earth when the earth was created. Okay, fine. You still have to deal with Exodus 20:11, which says that the heavens and the earth and everything in them was created in 6 days. That verse is still in the Bible, awkward as it may be. So we still have to deal with that. Even if you think that Genesis 1:1 is just a summary statement, I think Exodus 20 and verse 11 still constricts you. I actually found it quite interesting that Michael didn't deal. There are verses and passages. Now I'm making a more general point now, but there are verses in the passages in the Bible that you could more directly point to if you're going to try to show an old age for the earth. And maybe that's what we should do sometime, Mark, is try to steelman this and come up and say, well, here's what you'd have to do to actually show, because history is pretty much agreed from Abraham to today. On the timelines. I mean, there are definitely like hundreds of years worth of fluctuation. You have different people who take Egyptian timelines differently. You have even the monarchies and some of the rulerships of Israel people wonder about. But this is why Genesis, well, this is one reason why Genesis gets attacked so much, is because it's the only place in the Bible where you could find those millions of years if you were looking to find them in the biblical text. So be interesting to actually point out passages like Exodus 20:11 and others that could be more directly impactful on the age of the earth. But I think we've missed 10 out of 10 on this one.
Yeah, and this gets back to, okay, so Genesis 1:1 isn't specifically saying this is when God created the whole thing. This is when He starts to form it. Okay, so when according to the Bible did that actual creation from nothing happen? Because we know it did. There's plenty of other verses that tell us that.
Sure.
That there's absolutely nothing. It's like, okay, where do you insert the millions and billions according to the text? It's not there.
That's the question.
And as you said, okay, well, to answer that question, let's go to Exodus. What does this say? Oh, it seems to pretty clearly say. So, all right.
Yeah. I have to say, just for the sake of it, because that is one of the verses. If you could show that Exodus 20 and verse 11 did not mean 6 ordinary days, if you could show that, that would definitely deal a blow to the excuse me, to the creationist view. What's really interesting is all these scholars, we've mentioned a few of them tonight, Walton, Heiser, and there are probably a few others. Pretty much any of the Hebrew scholars who take the position that the Bible is not teaching the age of the earth all actually believe that the text is assuming a 7 regular day pattern. In other words, you've got a very small list. I frankly, I can only name one off the top of my head of Hebrew scholars who would affirm the Hugh Ross view that you could take these days to literally mean eons of time somehow. I'm not even sure how that works, but there's a few who would affirm that. You are either going to have Hebrew scholars for the vast majority. You've either got Hebrew scholars who think the text says a literal 6-day creation and means that, and that's actually what happened in reality, or you're going to have them who think the text says a literal 6-day creation, but it doesn't mean that for whatever reason. And so you'd have a pretty hard time showing that verses like Exodus 20 and verse 11 don't actually point to that material reality. So for what that's worth. But the best, I was going to say that the best argument that I've heard against that was from Tyler Vela, who said, well, if we assume Mosaic authorship, and Moses wrote Exodus 20 and verse 11 and wrote Genesis 1, then whatever he meant by day in Exodus 2011, he meant the same thing by day in Genesis 1. Of course, Tyler Vela, though, also does believe that this means that or that what's in view are 7 literal days or 6 literal days of creation and then a 7th day of rest. He just doesn't believe that literally that's what the text was teaching. He believes that was what the authors assumed. But yeah,
right. That he was using the concept of days in writing this polemic against the Egyptian gods. So,
yeah.
Okay. I think there's like one last little few moments of wrap up, unless there's something I forgot to edit off. So let's go ahead and take a look at that, and then we'll do some closing.
Now, I know some of these points might come as a shock to you, but we are not arguing this creates problems for the biblical worldview, just for young earth models that claim to be based on biblical texts. Given all of these points, the biblical scriptures don't seem to support many of the claims of young earth creationists. As we have argued, it is clear a plain reading of Genesis does not necessarily support a 6,000-year-old earth, and there are many issues that arise when proponents of this idea say we should just take the biblical text literally.
Okay, and this is where I keep coming back to, because he says that that many of young earth views on the Bible, it's like, okay, even if we take every single one of the things that if all 10 he was absolutely right and young earth creationists are wrong, it still has not one bit affected what's the age.
Right.
Because and this is where I really, this is where I landed, because for years, like I said, I grew up being taught, the Kent Hovind brand of Young Earth Creation teaching, and all of that. And I find it funny that a lot of the arguments that I hear from people against Young Earth Creationism are about 40 years out of date, or more. Of course, you know that more
Usually
than I do.
more.
But I got tired of the all of the back and forth about when was light created and what does bara mean and what is yom and whenever it has a and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, okay, well, hold on a second. You're nitpicking about some minor interpretive or linguistic details. When did the events happen? That is the question. And you either take the Bible from Adam forward as being historical. Now, it can include all kinds of metaphor and figurative thing, and you can have gaps in genealogies, and you can have the ages of the genealogies being figurative and symbolic numerology stuff. You can have all of that. Did these events actually happen in human history? That's the question. And unless you just say, no, they're all myth, well, then you're having to say, okay, well, these events happened. And at most, we're talking 10,000 years. So
Yeah.
Where did we undo Young Earth creation in any of this?
I mean, that's a great point. And I really thought that this video, I almost want to call it an expose the way it was set up, but I really thought that this video like missed the mark on a few very key points. I mean, if you'll notice that these were the biblical arguments that were supposed to create problems for Young Earth creationism. But you'll notice that, like, some of the classic ones, you mentioned some of those classic arguments that we see here, he didn't say anything about the word yom. You notice that? And that used to be such a hot button topic. Well, I assure you, Michael is well read in the literature of Hebrew scholars. You're just not going to find some wide swath of Hebrew scholars who believes that you can squeeze millions of years out of the word yom. You notice that you didn't hear him mention anything about the relationship between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. Because for a while, people wanted to insert millions of years of time into that gap, called the so-called gap theory. And the problem is that, again, grammatically, Hebrew will not allow what you need to have in order for that gap theory to hold true. So all of these places where before people wanted to insert millions of years into the Bible, you can't get them, it turns out, from Hebrew grammar. Okay. So what you have to do in order to sidestep the problem is, and again, I know, I realize that some people might be taking my language as, that he's trying to mythically devise some sort of cryptic. I hope you remember from the very beginning of this, broadcast that there's no ill will towards Michael, for any of this.
No.
It's just the reality is, this is what he's trying to do, is show the Young Earth creation has problems from the text, and he's failed to do that.
Honestly, whenever I saw that he was posting this video, I thought, oh man, I mean, because I'm a Young Earth creationist, and I'm like, dude, I mean, if anyone's about to torpedo this, Michael's going to, because like we said before, he's very thorough, very well researched. He is on, even on things that I disagree with him on, I would not debate him because he's smarter than I am. Because I mean, he brings his, I mean, whenever he does a topic, he brings it. And then I watched this and I thought that this doesn't even get into the age of the earth.
Yeah.
Like you didn't even address the topic.
Yeah. Not
what he
not
addressed.
one bit.
Yeah, and this comes back to, like we said at the beginning, he wasn't addressing the age of the earth. He was addressing a specific hyper literalist biblical interpretation that kind of often, like squeaky wheel gets the grease, gets the attention, but like next to no one actually holds that view. And it's something, like I said, a lot of times what's being pushed back on is 40, 50, years old or older. Because like I remember as a kid kind of hearing more of the more hyper literalist kind of argument. But I'm 42. I'll be 43 in March. I haven't heard that kind of hyper literalist talk for most of my adult life. And that's from the mouths of young Earth creationist scholars and proponents. I don't even know how hard, how much some of this would even apply to like a Answers in Genesis type. So some of this even I think answers would go, okay, Earth is still young.
Well, they would point you to 400 articles that they've written already addressing all of this stuff. And the same thing would be true of CMI. Now, I mean, you're going to have, again, there are ancillary things. Like, okay, another scholar who's a lot like Michael Jones. Actually, Michael gets a lot of his, I don't want to say gets his material from him, but he's a scholar that he relies on, is Ben Stanhope. You ever heard of Ben? No. His YouTube channel is Pixels and Papyrus, and he's got some videos that are a lot like Michael's. Some of his videos are directly addressing the Creation Museum. I actually just downloaded a book from Kindle that he released not too long ago that says 10 things the Creation Museum gets wrong or something like that. And again, it's often these points with like, okay, Behemoth and Job and Leviathan. Okay, what if they are not real animals and they are just chaos monsters, chaos symbols from the ancient Near East? Okay, cool. Maybe the Creation Museum got that wrong. Assuming that's true, maybe the Creation Museum got that wrong. What does that have to do with the age of the Earth? Now, I get the point, right? The point is, Answers in Genesis wants to find a dinosaur in the Bible with Behemoth, and they may or may not be able to point to the dinosaur in the Bible. If not, okay, fine. You still have to deal with the fact that God created all the animals supposedly in a 6-day period of time, around 6 to 10,000 years ago, if you do math and look at the biblical record and take these events as historical. So I'm not trying to find a dinosaur in the Bible. If it's there, great. That really helps. But I'm not necessarily trying to find it. So you have all these, these ancillary things. Stanhope was probably the first one I heard make the point about the ages of the genealogies and about Sumerian king lists and all these other things where you have parallels, and there's probably some sort of cipher going on there. Heiser, when he talks about it, he says, yeah, there's probably some sort of numerical cipher going on there, but I don't know that we'll ever know what it is. Okay, well, right now, we haven't found one, and you don't know what it is. So at least right now, grant me that we're not an idiot for looking at the Bible and just taking it. Okay, fine. Some of the numbers are rounded, probably. Like it's probably like if it said somebody lived 500 years, they might have been 498, like or something like that. Like we're not begging for strict literalism here.
I'm pretty sure if I lived that long, I'd probably lose count.
Yeah, right.
Just round it.
But the point is, 500. It doesn't necessarily mean that 500 means 30,000, and you don't really have any evidence that the biblical writer had that kind of thing in mind. And unless you can specifically address those things, then any of the little ancillary things, if you're mad about things that Answers in Genesis teaches about Behemoth and about whatever, okay, fine. But until you address the core question, like just stop. Just like, and the arguments, here I am ranting, but like, it's just like you said, so many of them get repeated. There's another scholar I just recently, the last episode of my podcast was a little bit of a rant I did. I think I titled it Creation Frustration. And it was talking about another scholar who just recently has taken up the cross of Young Earth, of arguing against young Earth creationism for some reason. And I honestly, like, I asked him on Facebook, I was like, why are you taking up this cross and yet repeating things that, like, I mean, he was talking about stuff like light created in transit. I mean, views that creationists have not held for 20 years. And I was just like, man, like, if you're going to take up this cross, read something that a young Earth creationist scientist has written in the last 20 years. Just please, I'm begging you. Or that a Hebrew scholar has written in the last 20 years that who agrees with I can give you a list. I keep a spreadsheet, okay? I can give you a list of active and retired Hebrew scholars who can argue from the text for a young Earth creationist position. Don't selectively read. Don't read only the scholars that you agree with already. Like, find some you disagree with. And I do that. I mean, I read Walton and Heiser and all these other guys. Like, read some of the guys who affirm young Earth creationism. Read Barrick. Read what's the guy? Robert. I always forget his last name, but his first name is Robert. He's written some really good stuff against the framework interpretation. He was at Dallas Theological Seminary. Read Stephen Boyd. Read Jeremy Lyons. Read these guys who take the young age position and are qualified Hebrew scholars and Semitic scholars. Read David Fouts, the guy I mentioned before. Like, don't stay so narrow. And I think, like, I can't for the life of me understand this selective scholarship. Like, why are they never considered in these things? Like, it bothers me.
Well, and one thing that hit me, and I don't even remember where I stumbled across it. And then once I went down that rabbit hole, well, whenever people start to say, "Oh, the Bible doesn't teach young Earth," the young Earth, I love this one, the young Earth creation, that the young Earth creation movement was birthed out of Seventh-day Adventism, and it's really only came back to what was it? The 70s is when and it's like you realize that it's like, even if the current iteration of the movement birthed out of that, for literally thousands of years, people have dated creation to a young. Right now, as we sit here in January 2021, on the Hebrew calendar, we are in the year 5781.
Right.
According to the Byzantine calendar, what was the official church calendar of the Eastern Church, we are currently sitting in the year 7529. So tell me again that young Earth was just some recent creation based on no.
Well, and like, I was actually going to post this on Facebook, and then I was traveling at the time, so I when I was watching this, so I didn't. I watched an interview the other day, came up on YouTube, between it was like a 20-minute interview. William Lane Craig being interviewed by the leader of one of these like Baptist fellowships somewhere. I was going to text, or I was going to post something to the effect of, "Oops, that awkward moment when your favorite, old Earth evolution affirming apologist agrees with young Earth creationism," and he made 2 points. That the whole interview was basically to get to 2 points. The first point was that by far for the vast majority of history, the church has affirmed a literal interpretation that would imply, okay, a young Earth interpretation of the Bible. That he said that is just without question. There was, and actually he went further than that. He specifically said, until the advent of modern geology, modern biology, modern astronomy, he specifically said, until the advent of those scientific disciplines, that was the majority position of the church. So, okay, young Earth creation has been preaching that for years. I don't care what quote you want to pull out from Origin or whatever, like that. It's just indisputable.
And even when you had people who would interpret Genesis more figuratively, they weren't imagining millions of years. I mean,
right.
Like the reformers, I think, even kind of argued about, like, why would it be 7 days? God can do it instant. He doesn't need 7 days.
Augustine held that view. Augustine held the view that it was done instantly, and that there had been 6,000 years of time no more than 6,000 years of time that had passed, but that the creation event itself was instantaneous. So, like you're like you're grasping for straws with that. And the other point that that Dr. Craig made was affirming the humanity of Neanderthals. He said, as I looked at the research, and there's more research that's coming out every single day, he said, I just can't deny that they had every bit of the cognitive ability as modern humans do. And so he said, I think in order to be biblically faithful and scientifically accurate, he said, we're going to have to include Neanderthal and the one that came right before. Was it Heidelberg? I can't remember. But Neanderthal and the one that comes right before Neanderthal man, we're going to have to be included in our definition of modern humans. And because of that, he revises the date of Adam and Eve to 750,000 years ago. And his when he makes the argument, he goes through this in his defenders class. Don't take my word for it. You can look it up for yourself. Honestly, the one move he makes that allows him to get back to that is that relationship of the genealogies. He does argue that Genesis is a mytho-history, but I think I would be fine for the sake of argument saying that Genesis could be written in a mytho-historical language or mytho-historical genre and still be a young earth. But for that, he has to make the move that the genealogies are likely non-literal, and that's really the only thing that he can say to get that amount of time in there. But he affirmed what young earth creationists have been saying and have been lambasted for decades. Oh, Neanderthals are not human. Even Hugh Ross and them, reasons to believe. Well, no, I mean, yeah, we absolutely have evidence that Neanderthals bred with modern humans, but that means that humans committed bestiality and that there were, all this stuff. And it's just with more and more research by unlikely voices, it's all, being confirmed for the young earth view. Now the Hebrew scholars are saying, well, yeah, it kind of is talking about 7 days, and it kind of is talking about a global flood. It just doesn't mean that. And the scientists are saying, well, yeah, actually, you could take. I mean, Josh Swamidas, I don't know if you've seen any of his stuff, but the scientists are kind of saying, well, yeah, like you actually could take Genesis literally and have all this, and well, yeah, Neanderthals kind of were humans, and oh yeah, by the way, the church has agreed with young Earth creationism for its entire history until the advent of modern science. All of these things are now being taught by the scholars who have disagreed with the view for so long. And despite that, there is still this constant, almost, what's the word for it? A denigration of anybody who believes in a young earth. Like, I just wonder when the cancel culture for young earth creation is going to start, because it really has, it's almost like that you're still a caveman. If you believe in young earth creationism, you're still a caveman. And yet the claims of young earth creationists keep getting vindicated with each passing generation. I don't understand it. I just don't.
Yeah. And I don't know. Because I know a lot of people, and I think I've shared before that what really did it for me. I mean, because I was brought up, I was taught that, people who don't believe in a 6,000-year-old, literal Adam and Eve, they believe evolution, that's the lies of the devil, and they're just denying God. And I was taught all that. And then I went to college, where I served in a campus ministry. And I served side by side with people who were born again, spirit-filled, God-loving, fierce warriors for the gospel on campus who believed in old earth or evolution.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, so you actually can love Jesus and believe this. And so that, just,
yeah.
And I just wonder, I don't know. I mean, so I think there's plenty of people out there who I'm not going to assign any kind of ill intent or scripture twisting.
Sure.
But for some reason, whether it's just the cultural milieu or whatever, they have old age just imprinted in their thinking.
Yeah.
And what we've seen through these top 10 reasons the Bible doesn't teach young earth is that even if they're all right, it's not addressing the age at all. And so therefore they assume the old earth then? I mean,
Right. Yeah. At the very
So-
most, they can interpret the text in such a way as to be consistent with an old age. And this is a point that my friend Doug made. I wish I could give him full credit. I'm trying to think of his last name. I'll think of it the minute we get off this call, but his name's Doug. He and his wife do some really great stuff with apologetics work. He said, what's really interesting is the best case that the old earth creationists can make is that the Bible is consistent with their view, but they cannot make the case that their text teaches an old earth. For the young earther, though, the best case is that you actually can make the point that the text teaches it. And of course, it would therefore be consistent with it as well. So I think that's notable.
Yeah, and I just I always keep coming back to the idea of, the historical timeline gets us back to Adam. Now, if you want to argue about how much time that actually is back to Adam, well, it's not 4004 BC. Okay, so Usher was wrong. I don't care. Tuagen is true. Okay, well then it was 5500 BC. But you get us back to Adam. So where do you get the time before Adam? Oh, well, because it ain't in the Bible. You don't get it in the Bible.
Sure.
You got, as we've seen in this video with IP, you get some places where you might be able to imply that it's possible that it would, but you don't. I mean, from what I see in the scripture, you get back to Adam. And then all the arguing goes on with Genesis 1, and either Genesis 1 is literal, in which case you have 6,000 years and 7 days, or Genesis is figurative, in which case you got 6,000 years. So,
right. Yep. Cool. Move along. Nothing to see here. And again, that's all well and good, and it's all well and good for me and you to say that. But when does it change in the public discourse? When is it okay? And I have to say, I also just listened to a stream recently between Joshua Swamidas and William Lane Craig, and I can always have my qualms, but I will say that I've heard an attitude. I heard it was, so what they were doing, they were actually addressing some inflammatory comments that none other than Ken Ham made toward William Lane Craig.
No.
And
Uncle
that
Ken.
actually happened. And and they were addressing the comments, and I think actually for the most part I agreed with Bill Craig, and there were times when he agreed with Ken Ham and times when he disagreed. There were, anyway, the point is I was actually encouraged by the language, especially Josh used, about, hey, let's open up a dialogue. Let's, they sounded willing to have some people dialogue with them on the issue. And so let's hope that's the case, and let's hope that it can continue, and that maybe the tide is turning a little bit, because as of right now, it's still, well, it's like being I don't know if I should say his name, we might get canceled, but it's kind of like being a Trump supporter, to be a young, in the midst of cancel culture, right? To be a young earth creationist in the midst of modern academia. It's talked about, it's denigrated, it's canceled, it's not given a fair hearing. And yet when somebody says, show me the evidence of wrongdoing, show me where I'm wrong, we get top 10 lists like the one we just went through that never addresses the actual issue. And we get arguments that are 40 years out of date and don't even assume an awareness of anything new that a young earth creationist has written. And we get told things over and over again that we've heard repeated, like, oh, well, church fathers believed in an old earth, and the Seventh-day Adventists made up here. We get all these things that are historically false. They're just false. And so at what point is somebody going to be willing to hear the facts and give the young earth creationists a fair hearing? And at the very least, stop insulting us for believing what we believe in the face. I mean, I saw a time, I didn't read it, but it literally like 3 days ago, my wife took a screenshot of this article on Apple News that was, we're going to have to rethink everything we know about the Big Bang. it's in shambles. And I didn't even read it. I'm just like surprise, surprise. Like, you know what I mean? I'm just, and of course those, it's the news. So there's always going to be some sort of, inflammatoriness there. But anyway.
Well, but I think one thing that I've seen happening is that on both sides, you have young Earth creationists who are willing to look at old Earth creationists and even theistic evolutionists and go, no, they're my brothers. They're just wrong.
Yeah.
And,
sure.
Rather than looking across the, table at them thinking, bunch of scripture twisting God deniers, right? It's,
right.
They're my brother, they're just wrong. And then on the other side, rather than it being you bunch of science denying fundamentalists, it's, okay, well, I understand that's what you believe, but we're brothers. I just think you're wrong. And I think that's one thing that's helping, is that we're kind of getting that going on rather than, because but we got a long way to go because, like I mentioned before, I got kicked out of a Young Earth group online on Facebook because I dared to say that you can be old Earth creationist and still be saved.
Right.
And all of a sudden, I was called every name under the book. I was called a wolf in sheep's clothing, a false prophet. I was called, and then banned, kicked out and banned from the group. And I'm like, all I did.
I mean, Young Earth Creationists definitely bear some of the responsibility. I mean, a lot of the responsibility for how, it's kind of like, again, I'm just going to make the analogy because I think it's a darn good one. You get people who say, and Christians who say, maybe if Trump had just kept his mouth shut, he'd actually got elected for another 4 years. I think there's some truth to that. I think if he had been spared a personal Twitter account, he may be the president today. I mean, I honestly do.
If we had more teleprompter Trump and less Twitter Trump.
Yeah, for sure. And so I think some of the, now again, we should call out people for false beliefs, sure. But what was demonstrated in that live stream between Josh Swamidass and William Lane Craig the other day was that a lot of times this inflammatory stuff goes beyond critiquing the ideas and it drifts into ad hominem and actually attacking the people as being pseudo-intellectuals, wolves in sheep's clothing, etc. And that's what's got to stop. And it makes me wonder, again, I don't want to put this in like a gory way or but I just wonder what's going to happen when that old guard isn't around anymore. And when some of these newer voices who are more gracious and more willing to, extend a hand across the aisle, extend that right hand of fellowship. You think liberty was fundamentalist? Bro, where I grew up, liberty was liberal. I'm telling you, like liberty is a liberal place with it. So I'm talking about that right hand of fellowship, brother. We got to extend that bad boy out across the aisle and get, and I think that the new guard is coming up, but the old guard still has a lot of influence. And, it may be that we don't get a fair hearing until those overpowering voices are no longer in the way, so to speak. I hate to put it that way, but to be that grim about it, but that just may be the reality. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Well, good stuff. Hopefully, I'm not under any illusions that Michael would ever see this, but if he does, maybe he'll realize his mistake and come up with 10 actual challenges to Young Earth Creationism.
That'd be great. That'd be wonderful.
Here we go. Well, let's go ahead and wrap this up here. Want to give a shout out to where people can learn more about you and find your stuff, because you got some good content out there.
Sure. If you do the YouTube thing, you can find it at Bible Nerd TV. If you like podcasts, you can find it at the Bible Nerd Podcast. And if you like reading, you can go to steveschramm.com. If you don't feel like spelling that, you can just go to enduringtogether.com, and it will actually just redirect right over to my website. So that might be a little easier to remember and to spell. I will say, give me, bear with me a little bit. I'm not producing quite as much content as I would like to be right now because I'm still trying to figure out the balance. I went full time in my business, my web design business, a couple weeks ago, and I've taken on like 6 new clients since going full time, and so I'm trying to figure out how to manage my time with this and try to still do the ministry stuff. So it's a challenge. So pray for me, but please find me on those places. I plan to keep producing lots of content going forward, but I'm just trying to get my sea legs and figure this stuff out. So.
Okay. And I will be sure to put links to all that in the description below. So, all right.
Thanks, man.
Well, thank
you for your time.
And yeah, thank you for doing this. I watched that video and I'm like, I got to respond to that. And I don't want to do it alone. So let's grab someone who's a little more knowledgeable on a lot of this than I am. So, all right, man, take it easy.
All right, bro. You too. Thank you.
And all of me, come within and take me deep.